Hey everybody, this is Josh O'Brien, the National Sales Manager with Yieldmaster Solutions. Today I'm excited to go through a product training with you for our nitrogen fixing product called Invita. Throughout this training, we'll talk about what Invita is, how it actually works, how it's different than some other products on the market, and we'll finish up with just some trial data from the last 4 years of our experience with Invita. So let's dive right in. So what is Invita? Well, in very simple terms, Invita is a naturally occurring food-grade bacteria called Gluconoacidobacter diazotrophicus. We abbreviate it as GD for very obvious reasons, and it was originally discovered in sugarcane. Invita does form a symbiotic relationship with the host plant, and it provides nitrogen to the cells throughout that plant, both above ground and below ground, all season long. So really, when we talk about Invita and how it's marketed out in the country, it's designed to bridge that gap between the availability of nitrogen versus the demand of nitrogen. So as you look at this chart on the lower right-hand side, you can see that gap in the yellow there. As plants continue to mature throughout their life cycle, the peak nitrogen goes up, but the available nitrogen unfortunately goes down. So we know that there's days in this plant's life where it wants nitrogen where it cannot access it. Invita will colonize that plant and will deliver that nitrogen to that plant on those days that we're talking about there. And that's really what we're going to go through here today. So our approach to the market is to not reduce nitrogen, to use your standard fertility program, add Invita in on top, knowing that there are going to be days where that plant wants more nitrogen, that it cannot access it. That's a big differentiator between us and some of the other products on the market today. So a quick timeline of Invita. I get the question a lot of times about, man, this is great timing. How did you guys come out with Invita right when the market needed it? And it really wasn't that simple. It's actually been in process now for over 25 years, but it was discovered back in 1988 by a group of professors over in England. And essentially, it took them about 7 years before they really had their first major discovery, which was that Invita colonizes inside the actual plant cell, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation on just why that is such a big deal. In 2012, they did form a company called Azotic Technologies, which brought Invita out of the research lab and into the market. And then in 2019, Yieldmaster Solutions was introduced to Invita and commercialized the product in the United States. So this is our message for the year 2023, is weatherproof your nitrogen with Invita. And oftentimes people think about weatherproofing nitrogen on wet years, right? What does that mean if we have a heavy moisture event where we're going to lose nitrogen through leaching or some other event there? And that's great. But what I'm more interested in is how does Invita help in the dry years? Because we know that dry years have a significant impact on the nitrogen availability to the crop. How can we help maximize yields in those situations as well? And we're going to talk about that here in a few slides. We're also going to go through how do you apply Invita, In-furrow versus foliar application methods. We're going to talk about the fact that it can be used on multiple different crops. We are not just a corn-only product here. If you can think of the crop, we probably have some kind of data on it. And then we're going to finish up with the multi-year data that we do have. So let's start where we started, which is the in-furrow application. We can still use Invita in-furrow. We've been doing it now for 4 years. It's a smaller piece of our segment market than it was in the beginning, but probably 15% of our customers still put it down in-furrow. But essentially, you can use it with starter fertilizer. There are some caveats to that. If you're going to apply it with a starter fertilizer, depending on how high the salt level is, we want you to buffer some water into that. A 10-34-0, which has a very high level of salt, we want 2 to 2.5 gallons of water per acre blended in with it. If you're using a lower salt fertilizer, like a 624, you can get away with 1 to 1.5 gallons of water per acre to buffer that salt impact. If you have growers or you are a grower that uses a dosatron system, that is a phenomenal way to apply the Invita product. It's essentially a side saddle tank that keeps the Invita separate from the main chemical or the main fertilizer and doses it into the line on the way out. This does a really nice job of protecting the bacteria from the salt all the way through the application process. But no matter how you apply it, whether you apply it in furrow or foliar, or no matter what crop you apply it on, corn, beans, wheat, etc., the application rate is going to stay the same. We are a 3.2 ounce per acre application rate, or the easy way to think about that is 1 gallon per 40 acres. Now, there are some distinct advantages to applying Invita in-furrow. You do get the early season benefit, early vigor, a little bit better germination, all of those early season benefits that you would expect out of an in-furrow product that you would still see with the in-furrow application of Invita. But really, the majority of our market today has moved to the foliar application just because of how easy it is to do foliar. So when you apply Envita foliar, again, it's the same application rate, the 3.2 ounces per acre or 1 gallon per 40 acres. It is compatible with herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. So what we tell growers is to apply this with your herbicide pass on a post-foliar application. And if you're going to do that, we have a good, better, best program when it comes to water. We want 12 gallons of water minimum, which is good. 15 gallons per acre is better. 20 gallons is the best. And really the reason that is we're going to get more coverage and the bacteria is not going to dehydrate off the leaf as quickly with the more heavier water rates per acre when we do that. If you remember to apply Invita, to add Invita to the tank last in terms of mixing, then you will be fine. Add your herbicide, then your water, then your Invita, or add your water, then your herbicide, then your Invita. But always remember just to throw Invita in the tank last and you'll be okay. We do recommend that you apply it with a good non-ionic surfactant that will help Invita stick to the leaf and penetrate into the plant more efficiently. But essentially, Invita will penetrate into the plant within about 6 to 8 hours through the leaf stomata. So it gets in there fairly quickly. When you do mix up a tank of Invita and go out and spray, we do really want it sprayed that day. We know that the longer it's mixed with chemical, the more harm that can be done to the bacteria. So within 6 to 8 hours is perfectly fine. But if you're going to leave it in the tank overnight and spray it the next day, there's probably going to be some diminished levels of bacteria in that tank. So as we look at the application timing, we're just going to cover the two main crops today, which is corn and soybeans. We want you to apply it between V2 and V6 on corn. And as we look at soybeans, we want you to apply it between V2 and V4. But as a rule of thumb, when applying it on pretty much any crop foliar, early vegetative stage is when we want to get down. That 2, 3, 4 leaf stage is really when we want to be applied. Now, as we're looking at that range of V2 to V6 on corn and V2 to V4 on soybeans, I often get the question as to, well, which one's better? Is it better to go out earlier in the season knowing we're hitting a smaller plant? Or is it better to go out later in the season knowing that that plant canopy is a little bit larger? Our experience and our trial data would suggest that the earlier we get it on the crop, the better the result seems to be. We know that you're going to spray a lot of soil when you go out and spray at V2, and that's okay. It only takes a few of these bacteria to actually get inside the plant, and once they're inside the plant, they will start repopulating on their own. So get it down early. Don't be afraid to spray it at V2, V3. But once it's inside the plant, it's going to really work basically the same, no matter if it's foliar or in-furrow. So this is a nice diagram that kind of shows exactly what the bacteria is doing inside the plant. So if you apply it in-furrow, the bacteria will enter the plant through the root tip. If you apply it foliar, the bacteria will enter the plant through the stomata. But once it's inside the plant, it's going to work the same. You can see in the diagram those little orange dots. That is our GD bacteria. That bacteria will colonize inside the plant, but more importantly, it's going to colonize inside the actual plant cell that you can see there. Once it's inside the plant cell, it creates these little air pockets, or what we call vesicles. And the easiest way to think about these little air pockets or vesicles is to think about what a nodule does on a legume, how it has the ability of capturing that atmospheric nitrogen around it. This little air pocket or vesicle is going to do a very similar thing. The really cool part, though, and the big difference is instead of being limited to being on the root of a legume on the outside, like a nodule is, we're putting hundreds of millions of these vesicles inside your plant, all the way from the root tip to the leaf tip. And essentially what happens is, as air moves through that plant, those little air pockets or vesicles capture a small piece of nitrogen from that air, primarily above ground in the leaf tissue, and fixate it. So what you're getting is a spoon feeding of nitrogen to that crop every day of that plant's life, until that plant either dies, freezes, or is harvested at the end of the season. So you're getting a season-long nitrogen dose. So how do we know that we're doing this? And that's a great question, because I think this is a really cool concept to get your head wrapped around, but where's the science behind it? And that's really what we're going to go through on the next few slides here. So on the left-hand side on the picture, what you're seeing, those little black dots, that is the GD bacteria that has been stained so we can see it underneath the scope. And you can see that it has colonized the edge of a corn root tip, which is a very important step number one. And on the right-hand side, now you're looking at those same little black dots, but you're looking at them on the section of that same plant in the corn leaf tissue. So we can actually see that, number one, we colonize the root tip, but number two, more importantly, we've now translocated from that root tip up into the actual leaf tissue. This is a critical step to be able to show that we're not just isolated to the root system, we're actually moving freely throughout the entire plant. But here's the $100 million question. How do we know that we're actually fixing nitrogen? And the way that we're able to show this is by putting plants into a growth chamber. They actually marked or labeled the nitrogen, the atmospheric nitrogen in that growth chamber, so you could see it under a very specialized scope. And then on the right-hand side, what you're looking at is the blue color is the actual GD bacteria, and that pinkish yellow color, that is our atmospheric nitrogen that we've labeled to be able to see it under a nanosim microscope, now being fixated on the inside of the plant. So remember, that nitrogen was in the air around the plant. There is no soil in that growth chamber. The only possible way that nitrogen could have ended up inside the plant is through that fixation process that we just showed you a couple slides back with those vesicles. Our GD bacteria is pulling nitrogen from the outside of the plant, fixating it on the inside of the plant. And last but not least, where does all that nitrogen go? Well, here's the really cool part. It's going exactly where the plant needs it, which is inside the chloroplast. So we know that nitrogen is part of the amino acids, which are building blocks of protein. These proteins are required for chlorophyll production, and chlorophyll is essential to the development of the chloroplast. And we know that the chloroplast is where photosynthesis occurs, which is essentially converting sunlight into chemical energy. So we are able to actually show you here on the left-hand side, that pinkish yellow color, that is that nitrogen isotope that has been marked that we can see under the microscope. And what you're looking at is the chloroplast of the plant. We can track that nitrogen directly into the chloroplast where photosynthesis occurs. One of the primary functions of plants, we can help assist with that chloroplast development, which is a huge deal. So not only can we show you that, number one, we actually enter in through the root tip. Number two, we translocate throughout the entire plant. Number three, we can fixate that atmospheric nitrogen from the outside of the plant. But number four, we can actually show you that we're ending up inside the actual plant cell of the plant. So let's talk a little bit about how nitrogen typically enters the plant. You know, if you didn't have Invita in your system, how would you get nitrogen into your plant? Well, most of you have probably heard mass flow versus diffusion. You know, basically how micronutrients and macronutrients enter into a plant. And you can see on the little chart here on the bottom, we have nitrogen listed. 99% of nitrogen enters the plant through mass flow. And mass flow is essentially the movement of nutrients into the plant as it absorbs water. So the more water the plant brings in, the more nitrogen it's bringing in with it, right? Well, that's great, except for if you come into a year like 2023 and your map looks like this. We know that we're going to have a dry year, or at least a dry spring. We know that we're below average on moisture in most of our crop. So if that plant is not bringing in as much water as it typically wants to bring in, it's also not bringing in as much nitrogen as it wants. So when we talk about reducing nitrogen and using Invita, we don't want you to do that because chances are Mother Nature's already reducing nitrogen for you by being a dry year. Here's some examples of what it looks like in a dry year in Minnesota here. You can tell right out of the gate that root development is significantly different. The stalk diameter of the plant obviously looks thicker, and then ear set. That's the big difference that we see with Invita, is just filling out that ear on a nitrogen short year, how we can impact that, particularly in a dry year. Here's another example out of Minnesota. Again, just that ear size development dramatically different. This is actually out of Baldwin, Wisconsin, on our 4-row replicated plots. You can see that the control side was firing pretty hard on August 5th. The next 4 rows over were the Invita treated plot. Again, right next to the control, and look how much healthier that side of the plot looks compared to the control. Invita is in that plant. It's fixating nitrogen. It's helping it stay green and stay healthy. And this is the ears that correlate with that picture out of Baldwin, Wisconsin. Obviously, the ear development is not close to being done yet, but we can tell early on that the Invita is going to have a significant impact on yield. This is actually out of Nebraska, and you can tell here that there's some dramatic shortages of nitrogen here with the dry weather that they had in Nebraska this past season. And look at the difference in the ear fill, the control versus the treated. I think they're probably both short a little bit of nitrogen, but look at how dry or how unfilled that control portion of the tray there is compared to the Invita portion. And this is actually against another competitor. Out in the country there, again, you can tell there's just some dramatic differences on the ear fill. Same field, just different parts of the field there, Invita versus competitor. The difference in the ear fill was dramatic, and I believe this was about a 10 to 15 bushel difference in yield when they actually took the crop off. So we've kind of talked a lot about the bad news about being dry and just what that means for plants on trying to absorb nitrogen. But there is a lot of good news here too. And the good news is that the largest reservoir of nitrogen is actually found in the atmosphere, in the air that we breathe, right? It's mostly made up of nitrogen. It's 78% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen gas, right? So what we are trying to do and what Invita is allowing us to do is to tap into that savings account, to tap into that large nitrogen surplus that is above ground and allow us to pull that into the crop on a continual basis to supplement what's happening below ground and to help us out in these adverse weather conditions, whether it be dry or wet. So here's some examples of a foliar application out of southern Wisconsin. You can tell just in the color there how different the plant health is going to be there on the check versus the Invita strips. So now that we know how Invita works and we know how to apply the product, let's talk a little bit about what the trial data has shown us. We've had Invita now for 4 years, and we've done trials all around the United States with the product, and we're excited to share some of the data with you today. So Invita on corn, 2022 was a fairly dry year in a lot of our plots. You can see our win rate was 85% across the 20 locations that we had it, and we averaged 9.7 bushels when we did win. A really nice return on investment there in 2022. Again, a dry year across many of our plots. We had a distinct advantage against the control due to that mechanism of being able to fix nitrogen above ground and pull it into the crop directly where it's needed, when it's needed. But this is what I'm most excited about. This is our multi-year average. We now have 122 data points over 4 years, 45 locations, 82% win rate, and when we win, it's by 8.3 bushels per acre. This is something that I think really shows how consistent Invita is. The fact that it'll win 8 out of 10 times. If you put it on enough hybrids, if you put it across enough acres, if you use it enough years, you are going to see a substantial return on investment with this product. So this is the part of the presentation where I look a little bit like a hypocrite because I'm going to talk about our nitrogen reduction trials, but I want you to take this in with a caveat of why we're doing this trial. So we are not doing these trials to suggest to you that you should reduce your nitrogen by 40 pounds per acre. The reason we are doing these trials is to show you what happens if you are short 40 pounds of nitrogen, whether that be due to dry conditions, wet conditions, equipment malfunctions, whatever the situation is. If you are short 40 pounds of nitrogen versus what you are planning on having, how does that impact your crop? And you can see here on these two replications out of Cushing, Wisconsin, that we were able to provide an additional 20 to 25 bushels per acre on a 40-pound loss of nitrogen situations. So when we talk about using Invita, yes, we can provide that additional top end of 8 bushels per acre under a normal type situation. But on these rescue situations, when we know you're going to be short on nitrogen, we have the potential to have an even more significant impact of 20 to 25 bushels, which for us is a great way of saying this is an insurance policy that if you run short on nitrogen, Invita will be in your system to help protect you to make sure that you're still maximizing your yields. So let's switch gears and talk about soybeans here. We had 10 locations out this year. We had a 90% win rate on soybeans, and we averaged 4.9 bushels when we did win. This is a little bit above average on our win rate, but we did have a really good year for Envita on beans weather-wise. We started off dry across most of our plots, and we know that Envita can really help supplement that nitrogen in those dry conditions. And then come pod fill time, we actually caught a few really nice rains. So we were actually able to fill out those additional pods that we were putting on the plant. So even though we were dry throughout the first half of the year, we did catch some nice moisture to be able to take advantage of that potential that Invita gave us. Here's some examples of what that looks like in, again, some dry areas in Minnesota here. You can tell just on the height and the branching just how much healthier that plant is with Invita versus without. This is actually out of Illinois. Again, on double crop beans, dramatic impact on just the overall height of the plant early on. And then here's our multi-year data on soybeans. Just under 70% win rate, but again, when we do win, it's by over 4 bushels per acre. This is a really high return on investment product. The first couple of years that we had this product out, we did have dry conditions as well, and it was dry during pod fill. So we weren't able to really tap into that potential that Invita was giving the plant. So you can see just how impactful this product is on a year that you actually get moisture to fill those pods. And across a 4-year period, 70% win rate is still pretty darn good. And the last crop we're going to talk about today is alfalfa. Alfalfa has been a really intriguing crop for us. We know that, again, going back to a few slides ago, we know that nitrogen is a building block for protein. So when we talk about alfalfa, the biggest benefit that we've been able to see with it has been in the form of quality, not necessarily tonnage. Although we do see about a 4 to 5% increase in yield, the biggest benefit, again, is in the quality. So this is out of Wisconsin for this year. We averaged just over 1.4 points higher protein, which last year I believe it was right around 1.5 points as well. We're consistently putting about 1.5 points more protein into that plant. And for those of you that have had to buy soybean meal and know how expensive protein is, this is a substantial advantage for you. Then how does that correlate to relative feed value? Well, obviously protein is a big piece of that equation. We're actually seeing about a 19-point increase in relative feed value using the Invita product on alfalfa. Now, here's the really cool part. When you apply it on alfalfa, you want to apply it after first cutting, in our experience, and then it continues to regrow with each new crop throughout the course of the season. So you do not have to reapply it on second, third, fourth cutting. So now you're spreading the cost of that product over 3 or 4 different crops. It becomes a non-factor from a price standpoint. So huge investment or return on investment potential using Invita on alfalfa. It will not overwinter into the next season. Unfortunately, the bacteria will die off in the winter, so you do need to reapply it each new season. So that's a look into Invita. We're excited to have you guys think about it and look at it for your operation. And it really is a nice product for supplementing your additional nitrogen needs that you may have for this coming season. Thank you for your time.